Imagine you and another person are on a deserted island. You are without food, water, or shelter. Yet, the island you're on is abundant with freshwater deposits, and fruit, and so on. Why can't you access these things? Because they are property of the other inhabitants of the island. You could try to use some of the island's resources without the assumed owner realizing, but if you get caught, you'd be in big trouble since they are armed and are likely to threaten your life if you try to pull a fast one. So, with no other options bar starvation, you decide to approach the owner of the island and ask if they could provide you with some sustenance and some form of accommodation. You approach the owner and they give you a rather unappealing offer, but this is all you can do for now. They offer you 10% of all the resources they gather and produce, and a bed in their island retreat. But in exchange, you must become their slave. So, with no other realistic options left, you decide to accept the owner's offer. What does this mean? You have next to no freedom or autonomy. You are bound by your owner's demands and are supposedly forever indebted to them. They care for your basic needs, but in return, you must work tirelessly. You are given demanding workloads that need to be dealt with in unrealistic timeframes, and you must work for 16 hours a day in order to meet your slave owner's demands. You have no free time, not for entertainment, not to educate yourself, you have no one to call your friend, and there are no potential relationship opportunities. As a result of your servitude, your body wears down, and your mental health has deteriorated. In this scenario, there is little help for you, as you are perpetually subservient to someone who only gives you enough to survive and serve them. In this scenario, you would be a victim of structural violence. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the concept of structural violence. This includes different forms of structural violence, how they affect people and the planet we live on, and even how structural violence is often a precursor to behavioural violence. So then, what is structural violence? Structural violence is defined as the suffering or disadvantage of groups and individuals impacted by social structures or systems in place. The term was first used by Johann Galtung, who wrote the article Violence, Peace and Peace Research in 1969. A social structure can refer to many things, including culture, economic systems, and the mechanisms of human interactions. For example, market economics would be a social system of how goods are allocated, whereas hierarchy would be a social structure, a way in which society is predominantly organized. Now, what are some forms of structural violence? The first thing that comes to mind, and arguably the most dire form of structural aggression, is poverty, often exacerbated by wealth inequality. We can define poverty as the state of being deprived of something, the most obvious being material needs such as the aforementioned sustenance and shelter. However, there are also other forms of poverty, such as that of health and social relations, like friends, family, companions, etc. The lack of material welfare can often result in these other forms of poverty. For example, in developed countries, we have a lot of people living in what is known as relative poverty. This means people can meet their basic needs, but often not consistently, and often at the expense of taking part in menial or stressful labour. How these people maintain their access to basic necessities is one thing, how they fulfill them is another. A relatively poor individual or family might not have access to the most nutritious food, and so they make do with whatever is cheapest or the most convenient. This often results in them consuming unhealthy, low-quality produce, which can have severe long-term effects on their health. This nutritional impoverishment is mirrored and magnified in developing and undeveloped nations, where we have absolute or abject poverty. In this case, people may not even be able to feed themselves at all. They starve to death. Now that we have an idea of what poverty is, what is the cause of poverty? Something that is present in most of modern society, whether in developed or developing regions, is vulgar levels of inequality. It is currently estimated that 5 people own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the world combined. While Euro-Anglophone countries and wealthy eastern regions have seen their economies grow rapidly, this newly found wealth remains mostly unseen by the majority of people. If wages are anything to go by, then in developed nations, the average person has not seen a significant increase in their standard of living since 1970, despite productivity skyrocketing in comparison. Meanwhile, CEOs in the US earn on average 354 times that of the average worker. In India, it's 229 times the average worker, and 148 in Switzerland. This indicates that CEOs and those high up in the business hierarchy are able to attain a significantly higher standard of living than most of the human population. This inequality is not structural violence on its own, but the things which create it are indeed so. Firstly, having a few rich elites in control of a high concentration of economic power often means that those elites will often implicitly dictate political decisions. This is seen in the American and British electoral systems, where wealthy individuals and businesses can donate to political campaigns and parties in exchange for favours, often in the form of economic liberalisation, meaning deregulation, privatisation, etc. This almost guarantees that politicians who do the bidding of the wealthy are likely to make decisions that negatively impact workers, the poor, disadvantaged groups, the environment, and so on. It is true that we have many democracies around the world, albeit very flawed ones. However, politicians tend to take action in favour of who pays for them over who gets them elected. This type of corruption is a form of structural violence because it actively promotes self-serving representatives and revolving doors, and represses the chances of the electorate to bring into power an individual or party that has an interest in benefiting the majority. Inequality of power, spawned from its precondition, inequality of wealth, does not end with political corruption, but runs much deeper. It is a part of our everyday lives. What do I mean by this? The workplace has traditionally been structured in a top-down, hierarchical manner. Business owners oversee managers, who oversee the operatives of a business. In a larger enterprise, the owner of the business may not take managerial tasks upon themselves, but will instead hire a CEO and or a board of directors to manage the company. Bill Gates, for example, is the founder of Microsoft, but does not manage the tech company's operations. He currently pursues philanthropy. With that aside, the hierarchical structure of the workplace has a tendency to produce a few specific outcomes, one being economic autocracy. Workers at the bottom of the business ladder tend to have little say in decision making, while the owner and those at the top of the ladder have near absolute control of the business, bar taxation and government regulation. This undemocratic way of conducting economic life incentivizes those higher up to care little for those at the bottom. A CEO is in control of a business. They are not going to be punished for paying themselves a salary that is disproportionately higher than their employees, and they'd be personal beneficiaries of doing so, which probably means the CEO is going to prioritise their own accumulation of wealth over the welfare of their workers. This type of practice could be considered structurally violent because it is something that workers and ordinary people have little power to counteract against. Sure, in many areas of the world, workers can unionise, although that comes with its problems. There is a chance that someone could receive punishment or discipline for unionising or becoming a member of a union, and many people are simply unaware of their workers' rights, and so unionising is less common than it once was, at least in the West. A general strike would be highly effective at encouraging workplace democracy and better working conditions, but it is difficult to organise and requires a massive amount of people, perhaps entire nations, to be carried out. In a developing world, the situation is a little different. The product of inequality isn't implicit like it is in, say, Europe. It is right in front of you, and its magnitude is more severe. Much of Africa and Southeast Asia has been, in effect, hostage to wealthier Western nations. In colonial times, countries like the Congo were attractive because of the nation's abundant natural resources. This is the case for much of Africa. Countries like China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh have recently been sucking in much of the world's big industry, especially in the computing and textile sectors. This is in part due to the business-friendly practices those nations allow, such as extremely lower wages than in Western nations and much poorer working conditions. In Southeast Asia, sweatshops are commonplace, and the conditions within them are comparable to slave labour. Of course, business interests are enticed by the prospect of cheap as chips labour, and so many tech companies like Apple and Samsung have much of their manufacturing operations placed within the continent, because it lowers their running costs and thus generates more profit. For the workers living and labouring in these regions, the situation is problematic to say the least. They have little choice on whether to work long shifts just to eat and keep a roof over their heads, or to starve and sleep on the streets. It seems like the profit motive, a primary function of how our economy is structured today, is the driving force behind the inequality we see in our own lives, and the suffering we see in the third world. Businesses, regardless of ethics, will ultimately go to great lengths to ensure that they generate as much profit as possible. It just so happens that the actions often taken to increase monetary profits consequently induce suffering and disadvantage for many people, incentivize inefficient use of natural resources, and degrade the ecosphere we all depend on to survive. The profit motive, then, is the source of much of the structural violence we see today: poverty, inequality, effectively forced labour, resource theft, etc. There are other so-called lesser forms of structural violence and oppression, such as institutionalized racism, hierarchy, and so forth. However, these pale in comparison to the economic violence that is present in our current world. So what else is there? Since our economy is structured around the profit motive, a specific behaviour has to be encouraged and encoded into our social DNA. Profit requires the purchase and consumption of goods, and so those goods need people to buy them. Since the dawn of the use of advertising by businesses, consumerism and consumer culture have also arisen. In between shows, on TV, playing video games on your phone, or watching videos online, advertisements appear everywhere in order to get you to buy more stuff, much of which you don't really need. Businesses started taking advantage of advertising when they realised that demand didn't just materialise naturally, but could also be created. Today, ads dominate much of both our physical and digital lives. This might seem harmless at first, someone who just owns a business paying for adverts to let people know their brand exists. Unfortunately today, however, many big corporations exploit advertising to absurdity. We could deem this practice as violent for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, businesses are effectively manipulating people into buying a product they otherwise wouldn't have bought or even thought about. We don't actually need a lot of the stuff we are advertised, even in the most lax use of the word need. Often, we are advertised products that are nothing more than obvious cash grabs. The gaming industry, especially on mobile platforms, is infamous for this. People are charged real money for not much more than numbers on a screen that don't impact people's lives in any real way. Yet, we buy the stuff we are advertised because we are told we need it. Hey, you need this in-game currency that gives you a quick dopamine hit. You need this new smartphone despite it only being marginally improved over the previous generation. And you need this new flashy car that will probably break within a couple of years. This brings me to reason number two. Because many people are manipulated into purchasing many products and thinking that because they own that product, they are worth more as a person and will be happier in their life because of their purchase, people become loyal consumers for specific brands. Brand loyalty creates a kind of economic tribalism, where people think that because they own more stuff, they are worth more, and that people who don't own the amount of stuff others own are seen as lower class citizens. A little extra thing I'd like to throw in here is the concept of consumer ignorance. Because of advertising and the price system our economy is based upon, it becomes easy for people to purchase things marketed to them without much regard for the negative preconditions of the production of these goods. As a consequence of consumerism, people have little care about whether a product was produced in sweatshops using child labour, or whether the company they're buying from uses wasteful practices like planned obsolescence, or whether various industrial practices destroy habitats and kill off wildlife. All that matters to the consumer in the modern day and age boils down to one thing: the price tag. Of course, consumerism is good for business. It generates more sales and thus more profit, little of which goes to those who labour to produce the goods and services we use, the workers. Hence why we have massive wealth inequality, as workers are paid below the exchange value of the things they produce. Yet, as consumers are sold goods and services at a profit. This means that wealth is constantly being extracted out of the hands of the labour force and consumers and into the hands of the already wealthy profiteers. This is a major reason why we have wealth inequality in the first place, because of wealth extraction by the already rich. The structurally violent economic mode we have today has its fair few consequences, one of the most prevalent being how we would traditionally view the term violence, as behavioural violence. Domestically and abroad, structural violence and behavioural violence are undoubtedly linked in various ways. Since the Neolithic Revolution and the installation of property rights, we have had to deal with the problem of institutionalised artificial scarcity. It is a fact of life that everyone needs resources to feed themselves, to landscape and cultivate land, to generate energy, etc. With this need for resources present, and there being a finite quantity, many societies have had to compete for them, often resulting in conflict and war. The Iraq War is still fresh in our minds. It was one of the most expensive conflicts in history, costed tens of thousands of lives, and destabilised the wider Middle East. To what end was this war? We know claims of the Iraqi government manufacturing WMDs was a fabricated conclusion that masked the true reasoning for invading the nation: oil. For decades, countries like the US and China have invaded and colonized many poorer countries in the pursuit of foreign natural resources. Much of Africa and the Persian regions are mineral rich, and so make for attractive imperialism opportunities. So, structural violence and the existence of dominant superpowers can make foreign affairs a little dicey. But what about the situation at home? There's two things I want to cover here. The first is the suppression of disobedience and protest, and secondly, what we refer to today as criminal activity. While many protests have been successful, such as the suffragettes movement, the civil rights movement, and many labour movements that fought for things we take for granted today, such as the weekend, many have also been thwarted, like in 2016, when Native Americans protested the construction of an oil pipeline in North Dakota, USA. The reality is that governments and big business have an enormous amount of power, and this makes protesting very difficult for those involved. Where protesters have picket lines, states and corporations have security guards and police in riot gear. Force is often used to silence the voice of the protesters, most of whom are peaceful. While organisations like Antifa have been effective at doing things like crushing far-right extremism, they have also gained a negative reputation for their aggressive behaviour. They are, however, a minority. Most protests are peaceful, but are often met with resistance from enforcement. This makes you question whether we really do live in a democracy. It is thought that poverty and economic and social inequality are responsible for much of the violent behaviour we see today, such as theft, robbery, aggravated assault, and so on. If you mix rich and poor in a single neighbourhood, it is likely that one of the poor members of that community would want to take from the more wealthy members, often by any means necessary. The poor have little wealth and struggle to keep their heads above water. The rich have wealth that the poor need more of. Many of the poor in society don't have the skills or qualifications to get into a high-paying job role, and so some of them resort to theft as a means of sustaining themselves. Why does this happen? Because behaviour is quite significantly environmental. It depends heavily on your physical surroundings, material conditions, and social interactions. When you are poor, you are focusing a lot more on your own survival needs than if you are comfortably wealthy. Things we consider crime today, such as shoplifting, are not indications of those who commit it being bad people, but instead are actions to be expected as a result of our survival instincts kicking in when we are faced with higher degrees of scarcity. This is what I mean when I talk about structural violence leading to behavioural violence. Poverty of material needs, a form of structural violence, leads often to theft and hyper-competition for resources. Behavioural violence is not remedied by the state placing people in prison cells for acting out their often natural instincts in the presence of scarcity. It in fact exacerbates it by not only demoralising those incarcerated, but also subjecting them to the psychological torture of living in a cage for an extended period of time, thus damaging their mental health and increasing their chances of recidivism. Material poverty, implying deprived access to resources, is only one form of poverty. There are also things like poverty of happiness and poverty of love and intimacy, which trigger malign behaviours in pursuit of gaining those things. The denial of needs, as we have discussed, is a definitive agitator in today's society and a major contributor to behavioural violence. In conclusion, we have defined what structural violence is, analysed some examples, and looked at numerous consequences of structural violence. including its inseparable link with behavioural violence. The topic itself is quite detailed, and I fully acknowledge that I haven't been able to fit everything related to it in this video. However, there are plenty of resources and pages online which discuss the topic. For now though, this is all I have time for. I hope this video has been informative and shed a light on just how violent our current social systems and structures are. If you want to see more content from me, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you have anything to add, leave it down in the comment section. I've been Adam Jones, thank you very much for watching, until next time.